Welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're reading our second chapter of I Will Always Write Back by Caitlin Alafaranca and Martin Gonda. And we started this last week. This will be our final chapter of this book because after the middle of May, we take a 2-week break to get ready for summer reading. So Teen Story Share will be back in June. But last time we read Caitlin's point of view, her first letter to her new pen pal in Zimbabwe, which was a country she had never even heard of before. If you'd like to check that chapter out, it'll be linked down below. And this time we're reading a chapter from Martin when he first discovers he's getting a pen pal in America. October 1997, Martin. Mrs. Jarai entered our classroom, smiling. "Class, I have pen pal letters from America," she said in a chipper voice. It was mid-October and toward the end of our school year, so this was a welcome surprise. Everyone started chattering. We all knew and loved America. It was the land of Coca-Cola and the WWF, World Wrestling Federation. Kids with money would Xerox different wrestling photos from American magazines they found in town, and then sell them to the other students. It was very popular to have an 8x10 black and white copy of Hulk Hogan. He was considered a god in Zimbabwe. My older brother, Nation, managed to get one somehow, and we hung it on our wall at home, using bubble gum as tape. It was a status thing. Do you have Hulk Hogan? Or Macho Man? This was my view of America. Men with big muscles who wore skull caps and knee-high boots and made lots of money. The big life. I wanted to know what kids my age were like in this faraway country. Mrs. Jarai only had 10 letters, and there were 50 students in our classroom. I was in group 1, so I was one of the lucky ones. The school year in Zimbabwe starts in January, when every student takes a placement test. The kids with the highest scores are put in group 1. I had been in that group for the last 8 years, since first grade. My mother made sure of it. On my very first day of school, when I was 6, she kept asking, "Who's the best teacher?" An older woman was pointed out, and my mother approached her and said, "This is my son Martin. Make sure he is in your class." It worked. I wound up in that class. At the end of first grade, there was a ceremony where the top 3 students were named. Number 3 was announced first, then number 2. When my name was called for number 1, I heard a joyous cry from behind me. I turned to see my mother jumping up and down like a rabbit, ululating, which is how we celebrate. I had to hold back a smile as her high-pitched cries, "Yo, yo, 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 yo," pushed me toward the front of the crowd where I received my certificate. On our way home, my mother said, "Martin, if you want to do well in life, you must always be number 1. I was number 1 again the following year, but then in grade 3 I took 2nd place. "Why didn't you take number 1? My mother asked the day I got my report card. Her face screwed so tight, her eyes were squinted slits. "The other guy is very clever," I explained, handing it to her. She swatted it out of my hand with such ferocity I was startled. I watched the paper as it fluttered to the floor and kept my eyes there as she shouted, "That's no excuse! Next you'll be number 5, then number 14. You must work harder!" "I will, Mai," I said, still stunned. I picked up the paper and smoothed it out on my thigh before trying to give it to her one more time. "I don't want to look at it," she said, quiet this time, but still fierce. "Or you." As I turned to leave, the report crumpled in my hand. She whispered, "School is your only hope." She took a deep breath and finished her thought. "Otherwise, you will end up like me." I understood. My mother wasn't being unkind, she was being protective. My mother was smart, but she had to drop out of school when she was 12 because her parents could not afford the fees. My parents were also poor, but at least I was still in school. I promised her and myself that I would always work as hard as possible. The next semester, I pushed myself and was number 1 from that year onward. That meant I always got to sit in the front row of our classroom. Since there were so many kids and not much room, 4 students shared a desk meant for 1. It was crowded, but it made it easier to share textbooks. The teacher only had 4, which she brought to class every day. I often stayed after school to take notes to make sure I understood what was being taught. We were very rarely allowed to take the books home. They were too precious. Everyone in Group 1 got a letter from America, but then Mrs. Jarai ran out, leaving the last 4 groups with nothing. I felt especially fortunate that I was in the classroom that morning. Due to the overcrowding in our school, each group was also split into teams, 1A, B, C, and D. That meant every day 2 teams would start classes inside and then finish outside beneath a big baobab tree. Our teacher would travel with us and sit in a chair, as we sat cross-legged in the dirt and listened to her read passages from textbooks, or lecture us on a topic. On sunny days, it was actually quite pleasant, but when it rained, we had to move into the hallways, which was not as fun. The other teams started outside and finished in. This was called hot sitting and was common throughout Zimbabwe. Mrs. Jarai handed me the first letter and asked me to read it out loud. We learned English in school. Zimbabwe used to be a British colony, but I spoke Shona with my family and friends. Mutare, where I lived, was 99% Shona. I knew how to speak English but used it only in this class, so the words felt funny in my mouth. I tried to mimic the voices I had heard on the radio and television, high-pitched and nasally. "Hello, my name is Caitlin," I began. It was such a strange name that everyone laughed. I had never heard of Pennsylvania and had a difficult time pronouncing it. But then I got to the part where she listed the sports she played and smiled. We had something in common. I played soccer daily with my friends, but had never heard of field hockey and was not sure how to say the word. "Field hooky," I tried. "Hockey," Mrs. Jarai corrected me before I continued. "I also really like the Spice Girls. Do you know them? Baby Spice is my favorite." Someone sang, "If you want to be my lover," and everyone laughed, including our teacher. The Spice Girls were very popular in Zimbabwe. "What is life like in Zimbabwe? I hope you write me back. Sincerely, Caitlin Stoicitz." The class burst out in laughter again as I tried to pronounce her last name. Mrs. Jarai just shook her head and smiled and said, "I cannot help you with that one." Mrs. Jarai told those of us who had gotten letters to craft a response and bring it back the following day. I always loved homework, but this felt more important than any regular school assignment. I had a new friend in America. That afternoon, I walked home with a bunch of other kids who lived near me in Chisamba Singles. It was a housing development built in the 1960s as a place for men from the rural areas to stay during the week, while they worked in different factories on the outskirts of Mutare, the 3rd largest city in Zimbabwe. My father had arrived there in 1980 after my older brother, Nation, was born. My mother grew up in a rural village several hours north of Mutare, near the Chimanimani Mountains. She had 2 older brothers and 1 sister. She was very clever and always was first in her class. The problem was that her family was dirt poor. They had no electricity and bathed in the rivers. My mother stayed in school until 5th grade, but then her family could no longer afford to send her. She dropped out, and soon after they sent her to work for my father's family because they could no longer afford to feed her either. She was 12 years old. Or rather, my mother thought she was around that age, as there is no formal record of her birth. She was born in her family's hut, as were her brothers and sister. This is how some people in rural areas of Zimbabwe are born. And it was also common to send children to work for other families. One fewer mouth to feed. My mother worked in exchange for her food and keep, which still happens today. My father grew up in a nearby village, and while his family wasn't wealthy, they at least had goats and chickens. They were rich compared to my mother's family. She was around 14 years old when she got pregnant with Nation. My father was 24. It was not like my parents fell in love. In Zimbabwe, if a woman becomes pregnant, our Shona tradition requires that she get married, or else she brings shame on both families. Basically, my father was forced to marry her. I don't think it was a choice for either of them. And I know it was why my mom was also very strict about any interactions with girls. I was not allowed to talk to them, or play with them, or even look at them. Shortly after Nation was born, my dad left the village for Mutare to find work. He got a job at Mutare Board and Paper Mills, the biggest paper mill in Zimbabwe. which was how he wound up at Chisamba Singles. He shared a room with another man. There were 4 rooms per housing unit. The men worked hard, saved their money, and then headed home once a month with groceries and money for their families. My father's original goal was to save enough to build a house in his village, but apparently he started to misbehave. My father liked to drink, and he liked women, so the story goes that his every month visit home became every 6 months. During one, my mother got pregnant with their second son, who died a few days after he was born. People said terrible things to my father like, "Why keep a wife who bears dead babies?" They even told him to get a new wife. Culturally, any issue around childbirth was the woman's fault, whether the child was crippled or he died. Polygamy was not common back then, but it also was not a big deal. My father's brother, Uncle Sam, had to get a second wife because his first wife only gave him 1 child. But my mom was stubborn. After she lost her second son, she insisted on moving to Mutare, into the 1-room shack that my dad shared with another man. They put up a curtain in the center of the room, and my parents lived on one side with Nation, and our roommate, Mr. Dambudzo, lived on the other. I was born there in 1983, 3 years after Zimbabwe was liberated, which meant I was one of the born frees. That was what people called children who were born after liberation from British colonial powers. In Zimbabwe, there's often some kind of direct significance to your name. Nation was named after my father's favorite cow. I was lucky. A medical student from England delivered me, and his name was Martin. If you were born on Friday, you could be called Friday, or if you were born during a dry period, you could be named Drought. I knew people called Disaster and Weakness. I have a Shona name as well. It's Tatenda, which means thank you. Nation's other name is Tawanda, which means we are many. He actually named our brother Simba, which means power in Shona. His English name is Mac, my grandfather's name. And then Lois, my sister, was named after my aunt. Her Shona name is Hikani, which means surprise, like, whoa, finally a girl. And then the youngest, George, was named for my father. George does not have a Shona name. I think my parents were too tired by then to think of one. My father was not the only person to bring his entire family to Chisamba Singles. Soon everyone did this, including his roommate, who had 2 wives. Each wife would swap every 2 weeks, commuting back and forth from the rural areas with her children. It was chaotic. Some weeks between our family and theirs, there were 12 people living and sleeping in a room intended for 2. During the day, we shared the same space, but at night we pulled the curtain across the room, which was meant to give us privacy, but you could still see and hear everything, a shadow puppet show. My mother and father slept on a single mattress, our only piece of furniture, which took up a third of our space. During the day, my mother stored our pots and pans beneath the bed, but at night she stacked them in the corner so Lois and George could sleep there. Nation, Simba, and I slept on the concrete floor beside them. This is how all the kids lived in Chisamba Singles. I know now this place is called a slum, but for me, it was home. I imagined Caitlin's life as very different from mine, and I was excited to learn more about it and her. The little I knew about America I had learned on television. Several thousand people lived in Chisamba Singles, but there were only a few TV sets in the entire settlement. One was a 15-inch black and white set owned by a man who worked as a manager at the same paper factory where my father worked. Whenever World Wrestling Federation with Hulk Hogan came on, or the A-Team with Mr. T, people would cram into his living room and gather around his house, trying to watch through his window. I sometimes climbed onto Nation's shoulders to get a better look as others peered through the door. As soon as I got home that afternoon, I showed my mother Caitlin's letter. I did not think my mom would mind that Caitlin was a girl. She was too far away to get in any kind of trouble with, and I was right. "You can learn many things from her, Martin," my mother said, smiling. I wanted to write Caitlin back immediately, but I had to do my chores first. First, I had to change out of my school uniform. I had only one. It was a pair of green shorts and a green shirt, which I wore every day, and washed twice a week, on Wednesday and then again on the weekend. My siblings and I each got a uniform every Christmas and had to make it last the entire school year. I changed into my regular t-shirt and shorts, which hung from my nail. We each had one. And then I went to gather wood for the fire. Our family shared a fire pit, which was directly outside our home, with 4 other families. There, my mother cooked over the fire in a large metal can, once used for cooking oil, that we now used as a stove. This way, we could move the fire into the house if it was raining. My father left every morning at 6 to head to work at the factory, and returned by 7 p.m. We'd usually hear him singing before we saw him, his husky voice bellowing a liberation song by Thomas Mapfumo, a Zimbabwean legend. Or, "It's only rock and roll, but I like it." My father loved the Rolling Stones, Cream, and Led Zeppelin too. "Baba!" I'd shout and start running past women selling tomatoes or mangoes on the side of the road, dipping beneath the clotheslines that crisscrossed between the dozens of identical wooden slab shacks. Nation and Simba would always come running too. My father used to surprise us with small gifts, perhaps a piece of paper from the factory, or a pen, or a coin for each of us to spend on a pack of peanuts. And he'd usually bring something for my mother to cook, greens or a bag of chicken feet. But these days, he was mostly empty-handed. My dad used the word inflation to explain why we no longer ate bread, which rose in price overnight from $2 to $5. Back home, we'd gather around the fire to eat, sitting on stones or overturned cans made into stools. My mother dished out sadza, a cornmeal porridge that is our staple food. Sometimes we had collard greens too, which were common and cheap. Chicken was a once-a-year Christmas treat. We'd get beans from time to time if our father could afford it, but lately it was mostly just sadza. After dinner, Nation and I had to wash the dishes before we could start our homework. Electricity was rationed from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., though sometimes it did not come on at all. That night, I wrote my letter by the light of the fire. I knew Caitlin was a girl, and I assumed she was white, which made me even more curious about her. White people lived in Zimbabwe, but I didn't know any personally. I had only ever seen a white person up close once before, when a group of people from the Netherlands came to visit our school. They were so pale, they practically glowed in the dark. They also smelled very sweet, like flowers. We called that the white smell. I think it was from deodorant. We used soap when we could, but if we ran out, we just bathed with water. That was all I had to compare to Caitlin. I wondered if she glowed in the dark and smelled like flowers. Did she know Hulk Hogan? Or was she just a regular kid like me? I did not want to overwhelm her with all my questions. Instead, I wrote a basic letter, using hers as my guide. I told her what grade I was in and the names of my siblings. I told her that I loved to play soccer and that I really hoped we'd continue to write each other. I promised her I would not let her down, and I hoped she would do the same. All right, I hope you enjoyed getting a little peek at this book. If you want to read the whole thing for yourself, this is available for checkout here at the library in the teen room. Have a great weekend, and I'll see you back here again in about 2 weeks, first Friday in June, for a new book with Teen Story Share. Bye!